Hello and welcome everybody back to the Philosophical Liberal. It is great to see you all. It's been a minute, as the kids say, or as we say. I like to think we're still kids
At heart, at
ourselves
least.
at heart for sure. Um, but yes, we took a little bit of a winter hiatus as we were working, Joy and I each respectively, on both work related to 1776 forward to TPL, as well as our other work endeavors. But we are back. If you caught the last one we released was kind of a wrap up on the Renaissance human ideal, where I shared some personal reflections and observations from my time in Italy last fall, which nicely coincided with our conversations around that. And in with the completion of that Renaissance human discussion, we rounded out what we had kind of identified or called in our statement our three ideals. If for those of you who have read the statement online, if you haven't, go to 1776forward.com and make that your first order of business, because that will make everything else that follows a lot more easily understandable. But for those of you who have read it and have been maybe following along on here on TPL discussions, we in the statement we reference three different points, what we call an ideal. First, the creator trader. We actually call it really the archetype of human nature at our best. But we use that ideal and archetype are used synonymously here. And then we talked about the continuous betterment, the ideal of continuous betterment at the start of Article 2, and then right after, following on that, the Renaissance human ideal. So if you're like me, the genesis of tonight's episode is from the question of, okay, wait, you said you had an ideal, but three different ones. So what does that all mean? How do I make sense of it? And so that is what we're going to talk about tonight. And so we've got a couple questions that I think will help frame and clarify what we mean by these three ideals. And hopefully that will inspire you all and make the connections a little clearer. So I thought, being that I'm kind of Mr. Definitions, that we might start with just the question of what is an ideal. And I know, Joya, you had some good thoughts on that. Um, and we'll kind of go through that before then answering the next question. The follow on is, kind of why these three ideals.
Sure. And I think this question of what is an ideal is an important one, especially because we are the philosophical liberal. And I think we need to clarify what we mean by ideal, because we don't mean what you might think of if you're thinking about idealism in a very traditional, classical philosophical sense. We do not mean idealism in the sense of a Platonic ideal. This is not an ideal that is somehow divorced from reality, an ideal that is in another realm. This is not, there's some sort of, let's say, the perfect triangle where all three sides are perfectly equal, because that, of course, is not what we ever experience in reality. So, the way that I define ideal and the way that we mean it in this statement is as a standard of excellence. And really, what we're talking about throughout our discussion here, as far as I'm concerned, really is just one ideal, because we're not talking about ideal triangles. We're talking about the ideal human experience, and then talking about what goes into that. What are the standards of excellence? And with this definition, first, I think it's important to point out that this is an idealism that is meant to be realistic. As
Mm,
someone who can often be described sometimes as a recovering perfectionist, I've perhaps
mm,
learned the hard way that perfection is can be a very unhealthy goal even to pursue, because it can keep us from actually making true, real progress in reality toward things that are good. That said, there is real benefit to defining and aspiring toward and working toward a realistic ideal. And that is definitely something we wanted to make sure not only to put in this statement, but really to ground this whole statement. because well, perhaps it's another way of thinking about the way that we combine things that perhaps seem to be contrary or paradoxical, like the individual and the social, or reason and emotion. And here's another important one that is core to our whole philosophy, which is combining the ideal with the real.
Mm.
Because on the one
Hmm.
hand, we want to have an ideal, we want to have something noble to aspire toward, to work toward, to set the standard of excellence, my definition here. We don't want to fall into the trap of a realism that is divorced from these real considerations of moral goodness, which can often happen sometimes. I think in the freedom movement, the liberty movement, there are, of course, many practical arguments to be made about why freedom makes practical sense. And those are things we, of course, want to talk about. But we want to make sure that our project is grounded not only in the practicality, but in that philosophical, moral goodness. And so that's why
Mm.
idealism is so central to our project. And as I mentioned here, there really is just one grand ideal that we're talking about here. We're talking about the ideal human experience. That said, there's many ways to consider this. And frankly, I didn't even realize until after we wrote the entire statement that we described the ideal in three different ways, and hence
Yeah,
needing this
same.
conversation. But the best way that I like to think about why we even have three different descriptions of this one ideal of the human experience, I like to use this metaphor of the jewel and think about them as different facets of the jewel, different ways of thinking about or looking at or describing lenses into what is the ideal human experience. And so these are the three terms that came up in our statement. And I think it's worthwhile to explore these three and why they contribute to this one ideal and how they're all related and connected. Maybe I'll then turn it over to you to hear some of your thoughts about this ideal, the one ideal with the three facets that we are exploring today.
Well, yeah, thank you. That's a perfect setup for, I think, question two of, I'm happy to dive into at least sharing how I make sense of the three ideals and why these three. But I just wanted to reflect first on your point that idealism, it's reality grounded, but it is the standard of excellence is kind of the key counterpoint to that because oftentimes, insofar as the word pragmatism or the ideology of pragmatism and the kind of notion of practicality is taken synonymously as realism or reality. I think especially today's day and age, that is kind of taken as kind of unambitious, kind of accept the world as it is. And any of you who have both read our statement or listened to any of our chats here on Substack, you will know that we are all about seeing the world for its infinite capacity and certainly human life and human potential for its infinite capacity. So we certainly eschew fully a kind of low aims or low ambition kind of pragmatism. And so but we are not, like you said, striving for kind of an impossible ideal or an otherworldly kind of abstract floating abstraction. It's and so I like the language of standards of excellence because it just implies that you can be reality oriented, but still aim for and hold yourself to very high expectations. And those are, in fact, I mean, it seems kind of self-evident when you actually say it, but I think a lot of people either take it for granted subconsciously or actually don't appreciate it at all, which is that, that's the only real way in which progress and achievement happen is by individuals and then even groups of individuals holding themselves to a higher standard, aspiring and aiming for, and then ultimately working to achieve a standard greater than just the everyday status quo the pragmatic reality that they find themselves in. So I just think that's an important thing to emphasize is that you need both. I like how you framed it as another both and kind of duality, but that both are ultimately still rooted in reality. So that is key, and I agree with you about just the and then the moral angle here too, that idealism is important to our project because, like we say in the preamble to our entire statement, philosophical liberalism, it is grounding the ideals of liberalism. There's that word again. Many of the ideals of liberalism, the political ideals, in a deeper and broader moral view of human nature at its best. And then I think that sets us up then into this second question of why these three ideals. Um, Joy and I have been having this debate about kind of, are these different ideals? Are they connected or separate? This notion of a single ideal of kind of human experience or maximum human experience, or, are these just kind of different ideals that we should think about differently? Um, but I think I've come around to your view about the kind of different facets of a single ideal. But the way I kind of think of them is that they're separate and distinct but related. Um, at least they're different concepts, and that's why I think we called them out differently. And so as I was like you, I too don't think I fully grasped that we had given three different names to an ideal until after the fact. But now as I kind of overlay my own understanding of what we were doing and trying to say with a better viewpoint a year and a half onward, I feel like I can backfill that a little bit. And so I'll start with your point about morality because that is really what we were trying to do here. The whole point of Article 2, as we've said at the outset, and it's going to become even more apparent as we move into part 2 of Article 2 here next on the virtues. But the whole point of Article 2 is moral applications of freedom. That is the title of the article. And we really did want to provide, this is really our answer to the question of why does freedom matter for you as an individual, to give a moral basis and grounding, and really, again, an ideal, something to aspire for, something that would be inspiring to individuals of why they should care about freedom, not just because it's in accordance with human nature and kind of the very abstract and theoretical intellectual level that we talked about a lot in Article 1, but that it not only matters for your life, but that it gives you something really grand to aspire towards. And so that is really, in a nutshell, what all three of the ideals are serving, is they're our answer to that question. And I just wanted to even reread our opener of Article 2 because it helps me answer this question of how they all relate. But we said, through the freedom to continuously actualize on our potential, human beings can achieve a noble ideal, a self-chosen life focused on growth and the development of a virtuous character. And then we go on to say some other things. And then when we go into kind of the first sub part of Article 2 here, the noble ideal, continuous betterment, we say the nature of life is to grow or to die. Human beings thrive by pursuing continuous growth in our capabilities across multiple domains, achieving both material and moral betterment along the way, i.e., the Renaissance human ideal. So those rereading those paragraphs, even for me, helped me make the distinction clearer. And so the way I kind of think about the three ideals is, and then we said earlier about creator trader as our archetype for human nature at its best, and how it kind of subsumes all the other great aspects of human identity and human capacity that we've talked about previously. So with those three kind of standards or kind of painter's poems in mind for each of our ideals, the way I kind of think about it is that the three ideals, they are interrelated, but they kind of stack, they're cumulative and build off of each other. that, if we go back to that, we were trying to sketch out ideals that answer the question of why does freedom matter for you in your life, then the three ideals are really, that's the answer, because this is what they make possible for your life as an individual. And in particular, I kind of see continuous betterment as the foundation, if you will. It's really um, the it's the choice to grow or to die, as we say, that fundamental choice that freedom makes possible. And then Renaissance human, as we said, is developing both your material and moral capacities and betterment. Ultimately, that's what continuous growth enables, even. And then, lastly, through doing that, through kind of actualizing on your full potential, you can be a being capable of great creativity, problem solving, resource making, and then certainly collaborating with others doing the same, where you can solve even bigger problems and create even greater resources. And so to me, even that kind of gives a nice both logical link between the three, as well as a somewhat of a hierarchy. Maybe you'll differ in my kind of framing of that, but that is, I think, what we were trying to do, and to me, anyways, how I kind of um, connect them, and why I think, honestly, I think, even as I told you offline, but as I was even reflecting on it, there's a kind of nice symmetry in that we have our three core values of philosophical liberalism: freedom, flourishing, and greatness. And then we have three ideals, or three facets of one ideal. And we can talk about it in a bit, but I even see maybe some parallels between the two sets of three, if you will. So I think there might be something there too, that in a sense we're echoing those foundational values in our three different facets of the ideal.
Well, I know you love your symmetry, but all of a sudden I realized when you read the statement again that we actually maybe even have more ideals that we talked about, because even in the way we phrased that sentence, we talked about the noble ideal as also the self-chosen life of
Hmm.
continuous betterment. So maybe that also needs to get thrown into the mix of what we actually think about as the ideal. But this is still to my point that we're really talking about just one ideal, which is the ideal human experience. These are not ideal triangles. But to your point, I think you're right that there is benefit in this exploration of the different ways that we describe different aspects of the ideal and how they all connect and are interrelated. And perhaps there is a certain hierarchy to them. And I would agree too that certainly this idea of continuous betterment. I see it as really grounded in our biology, something that really is unique to the human experience, that we grow or die, that we're perhaps different from other organisms that reach a level of maturity and then we just stay there until we die. Where part of what makes the human experience so grand is that we have this capacity to continuously grow and develop throughout our whole lifespan. And in fact, we only flourish if we do that. And we can perhaps even think of how this relates to our own personal lives. If we think that perhaps we reached our maturity somewhere in our early 20s, at perhaps the age when we graduated college. Think about all the ways in which everything that we learned in college does not prepare us for the era we're living in now, 20 years later. I mean, we've perhaps never lived in an era when it's more important for human adults to realize that whatever level of development you might have reached in your early 20s is not going to sustain you for even the next 20 years ahead of us. But this is precisely what makes the human experience so wonderful and fascinating, that we have this capacity to, in biological terms, I guess you could say, adapt to different environments, but we also
Mm,
create the environments. We create
right.
the environments and need to adapt to them. So there is this real underlying biological imperative of grow or die. And then I see the Renaissance human ideal as giving specificity to ways that we can grow and the different facets and fields of potential that we can, and I think ought to, explore to maximize our human potential. And then you made the point to emphasize that we are talking about the ideal human life, but then to connect this with our idea of that as human beings, we are both individual and social beings, that we are the
Mhm.
social solitary. The creator trader, I think, then just helps take us to that social level to think about that what it means. The ideal for the individual is for us to be the creator, but we can't just be a creator or trader by ourselves. That even how we become a successful creator is even through trade and interaction with others, and then our best creations are expressed and manifested when we engage with trade in the social level. So I guess the ideal is the ideal human experience, but it's the ideal human experience recognizing that this is both individual and social. And now I feel we also need to talk about this idea of it being self-chosen as well, that this is something
Yeah.
else that really is core and unique to the human experience, this capacity of choice that we have at such a fundamental level that again makes us different from perhaps all other organisms that we know of yet, but that is so core to the human experience, and that we really need to embrace this capacity for autonomy and agency that we have and make the most of it to really have that self-chosen life, as we talked about in the discussion when we explored that phrase.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, so you took the words right out of my mouth. If you recall, we actually did pause on that terminology at the beginning of Article 2, right? Because we talk about the self-chosen life, autonomy and agency, and maybe the subtle nuances between the three. But that, in fact, I think we even said in that conversation that we felt the self-chosen life was the best terminology to describe what it really is.
You
Uh,
described the noble ideal.
Describe the noble ideal. Yeah, we just didn't quite call it an ideal then, but we are, I guess we are now after the
Yes.
fact.
Well, in
But
the statement
yeah, exact. But and it, there's power in that term. I mean, for me personally, I'm biased, of course, because I wrote it, but
we wrote it.
I know I say I like I meaning means both of us here,
Okay.
always. We both wrote it, yes. But
You might have been the first to generate the phrase, but we did write the
well, the
document.
self-chosen life, I do feel like that
That came
sounds
from you.
more like me, but regardless, when I use the I here, I always mean both of us. But was just talking in first person terms. Um, but I mean, so I may be biased, but like that terminology in and of itself is noble and idealistic to me. It kind of just resonates on an emotional level with what freedom is all about, right? Is that fundamental choice to choose your life. And the interesting thing is, I think most people, at least most, the average Western and American citizen who is still, shall we say, at least on an emotional level, a liberal, if not necessarily on a conscious ideological or political level, um, they grasp on some level and would probably even say if you ask them that they want to make their life what they will. Even the American dream, I think we talked about that that's really what it is about, is having a self-chosen life. So I think there's power in that. Like that is a noble ideal, right there, the ability to choose your own life, and that's a key part of what freedom makes possible. And so that's another reason why it's part of this noble ideal of the ideal human experience. It starts with that fundamental choice to grow and to grow in the way that you want to. Really, that's what a self-chosen life to me means. So yeah, I think all of those are key. And I just want to emphasize another point that I think kind of wraps into that third question of the connection of these three ideals. I think we've kind of already spoken to that um, throughout here, but another reason why perhaps I would argue creator trader is kind of the culminating ideal is we talked about even way back when we did first write this that creator trader in and of itself is kind of an ideal on multiple levels, both as in for you as an individual and for society at large and for you. So I think it's an ideal for each of us as an individual in two different facets. It's an ideal for you and how to think about your life as a creator, to think about how you need to solve problems and generate resources both for yourself, the creator side of the equation, but also then to trade it with others, the trader half of that. But it's also an ideal for how you deal with other people, in that we need to be social, not just an island unto ourselves, and that it's through that process of collaboration and communication with other people that you really achieve your full creative potential. So to me, it's an ideal on two levels, at the individual level, and then it's an ideal, obviously, if we've put forth of how we think a free society operates, in that it's win-win voluntary relationships where the sum is greater than the individual parts. And so I think the fact that even that facet of our overall ideal, the creator trader, is itself a nested or multi-layered ideal, just gives it that much greater power and influence, because perhaps of what you said, that it kind of encapsulates this reality of us as both the individual and the social, and how we should, or how we ought to, and how we can at our best um, engage with both ourselves and the wider world.
Now I'm curious, so do you want to say more about how you see these connected with our core values of freedom, flourishing, and greatness?
Yeah, I won't make too much of the connection. To me, it's more of an echo rather than a direct kind of one for one mapping, but and maybe it was coincidental, or maybe there's something more to it. I guess I'll have to mull that one a little more, but it did occur to me as I was just prepping for this discussion and mulling these questions, that there was some symmetry there. I would say, so our three core values of freedom, flourishing, and greatness, those are really kind of at the 30,000 foot level what we would say philosophical liberalism is ultimately all about. Like that is what this set of ideas and ideals makes possible for, you might say, human life as such, but also your individual human life. Um, and as we talked about in those, they kind of also stack onto each other insofar as freedom is the starting point. It's that fundamental choice to be or not to be, to live or die, kind of, if you will. Um, and then freedom makes possible a flourishing life ultimately, which then opens up the possibility of greatness in the ways that we've defined and talked about it. Well, as I kind of hinted at when talking about these three ideals, insofar as if you think that they also stack similarly, as I've argued, then they kind of operate similarly. The continuous betterment, kind of, even as you said, that kind of, it's that baseline or starting choice to grow or to die, rooted in that biological reality, if you will. Um, and that, I guess I would say, once you make the choice to grow, it kind of begs the question, in what direction? And this is where we talk about building virtuous character, and then your kind of creative capacities, the moral and material uh, domains, if you will, respectively. Um, and as we've argued, and even both are definitions of flourishing and Renaissance humanism, that both of them touch upon this notion that as human beings we have multi-dimensional capacities and abilities. We can be athletic and physical, we can be intellectual, scientific, we are relational and social with friends and family. We, you know, can create wealth, both material and spiritual wealth, all of these different aspects. And the we've argued in both cases, flourishing and Renaissance humanism entail trying to engage as many of those as possible and develop as much breadth and depth across them as possible. So I see symmetry there. And then, in the same way that we argued, kind of getting to the point of flourishing also opens up the possibility to strive for that highest level of human potential, which is greatness, so too I see, creator trader as an ideal. That's kind of what, I would say you can be your best creator when you have great breadth and depth. We talked about it even in our last sessions of Renaissance humanism, that part of what made those Renaissance men of the past and present so great is that they had great breadth and depth across so many different domains and could draw upon it for their own creativity. Um, and and to me, what the creator trader ethos is all about, that win-win, is my three P's that I've mentioned in the past: peace, prosperity, and progress. And to me, what greater purpose in life is there than those three? And so insofar as if you think creator trader is the way to get to those states of living those values, then it kind of mirrors that highest state of greatness.
Well, let's now, I think, explore this perhaps other facet of our noble ideal, this idea of the self-chosen life, and connect it specifically with freedom, because I think this will be the piece that then just ties everything together and really gets at the heart of what we're trying to do here. Why
Yeah.
is it that we're talking about ideals in what is ultimately a political project, a philosophical political project? And I think the self-chosen life concept really helps make this clear that we've talked about freedom, as you were mentioning when we were having our discussion about the core values, freedom, flourishing, and greatness. We've talked about how freedom is both the starting point and the end that we're aspiring toward. And it's kind of a beautiful spiral, if you will, that we need a certain grounding of freedom just to get us started, but that the ultimate goal, what we get, the great reward at the end, is this experience of freedom, of living this free life, this self-chosen life, as as we've described it. And I think you did come up with that phrase as it is in
I don't need authorship of it.
but I do think that it's a key aspect to mention, even as we're talking about continuous betterment, as we're talking about being the Renaissance human, as we're talking about being the creator trader, that underlying all of these is this fundamental choice that we have as humans, that this fundamental freedom we have, that we have to exercise, that continuous betterment requires a choice to grow, that so it's, we've talked about, you grow or you die, that stagnation is death, but stagnation is the default when it comes to the human experience, that the kind of growth that happens naturally does end by the time you reach your early 20s. Like
Right.
you don't have to choose adolescence, like you will go through that naturally. But
Right.
once you hit, let's say, your early 20s, any growth that's going to come after that has to be made because of some kind of internally willed choice.
Mm.
And it is the
Hmm.
choice then to grow
Yeah.
or to stagnate and die. And then similarly, that you have this potential that can be expressed in the Renaissance way of exploring different fields. But again, that you have to choose that. And it's an uncommon choice, even in our common era where we're perhaps driven more toward specificity in the job market. So really, if you were going to actualize your potential in a broader sense, that has to be something that you choose. And then ultimately, the creator trader, to as you made the point, that we're asking people to choose to embrace this as an ideal for your life, for your interactions with others, for society. Again, creativity doesn't just happen. You have
Right.
to will whatever creation it is that you are going to bring to the world, and will that way of interacting with others and building that kind of society.
Yeah, well said. And I would just add that I think this perhaps, we're so steeped in this that sometimes maybe take for granted what is obvious or what's not. So sometimes we might be a little didactic or repetitive, but it's to hopefully say things from a different angle in hopes that it maybe lands for different people. But I think this point is key, that if you follow kind of what the arguments we've been making tonight about the interrelation and interconnection between all of these and how freedom enables each of them, I think creativity, a lot of people hold it as an ideal, if you will, to aspire towards, that it's a good thing. And if anything, I have argued, at least privately with you for many years, and I'm increasingly arguing publicly that we have our society and current culture has a too narrow view of what constitutes creativity and how one can be creative. And I think it turns off and deters too many people from experimenting and exploring their abilities. Um, but I think most people still hold it as an ideal worthy of aspiring towards, whether they ever actually take action towards it or not. And so I would argue that this formulation really, these three ideals and being grounded in freedom, kind of these three facets of the human experience ideal, insofar as it kind of shows you a roadmap of how to achieve creativity through freedom, that to me is another just endorsement for our project of for a free society, because it's the answer to how do you be more creative. It's through having the choice to think and act on your own terms, build that self-chosen life, grow across the many different interests and passions and capacities that you have in your life, discover the connections, and then ultimately be able to experiment and explore and collaborate with others to solve problems, create resources, new ideas and new products, and unleash that creative ability that is within all of us, but that I think too often either gets stifled or just is never even really ignited for reasons that often I think have no more malign or nefarious cause other than that people don't really know where to start. And so I would argue this in a way, these three ideals or these four ideals now is kind of another answer to that question. So I certainly hold creativity as a high ideal, and so I think I hope that this helps. This is another inspiration for people as to why freedom matters.
And maybe that even leads right to our call to action for the week to help people perhaps think through their idealism in a more articulate way.
Sure. Yeah. Do you want to? I think you said it well earlier when we were talking and prepping for tonight, but do you want to kind of give the call to action?
Sure. So in this conversation, we've described the we see is the importance of having a sense of an ideal for the human experience. And we've talked about, as I've described them, the different facets of this jewel, the different ways of describing it. And you've now added another one, adding creativity as another way to think about the ideal human experience. I think we somewhat capture that in the creator trader for
Yeah.
sure. But even just highlighting that on its own, the creative aspect of the creator trader. So, what we wanted to ask all of you is to just think about these different ideals. If any of these ones that we've talked about particularly resonate with you, or if there's some terminology that you have, something that we haven't put on the table yet, ways of thinking about this ideal human flourishing great life, we would love to hear it and perhaps even expand out our sense of the idealism that we are arguing for here.
I love it. Yes. Give us your best ideals.
Yes, exactly. That's what
Awesome.
we'll just call it. Give us your best
Give
ideals.
us your best idea. I like it. So, but no, but we want to hear your feedback also on the various facets of our ideal jewel that we've put forward as well. But whatever resonates with you, look forward to hearing from it. And with that, we will talk to you all in 2 weeks.
Yes. And we will be starting to explore the virtues, which is just another way, I would argue, of thinking about the human ideal. Just another way of turning this jewel and looking at a different facet of it, the virtuous actions that make up the ideal human life.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Can't wait.